GOP in disarray as budget impasse threatens shutdown, deep cuts UN default. Senate Republicans and the Trump administration are struggling to reach an agreement on a path forward on critical budget and spending issues, threatening not only another government shutdown and deep spending cuts but a federal default that could hit the economy hard. GOP leaders have spent months cajoling President Trump in favor of a bipartisan budget deal that would fund the government and raise the limit on federal borrowing this fall, but their efforts have yet to produce a deal. And the uncertain "We're negotiating with ourselves right now," said Senate Appropriations Chairman Richard C. Shelby R. Alabama. The president, the GOP dysfunction coupled with a new House Democratic majority with its own priorities leaves the sides much farther apart than they were at this point in last year's budget process, which ended in a record-long government funding lapse. At the time, Trump and Congress face a trio of difficult budget issues. Congress must pass, and by year's end, they also need to agree on how to lift austere budget caps that will otherwise snap into place and slash $125 billion from domestic and military programs. Senate Republicans and the administration thus far have not agreed on how to proceed on any of the issues, making it all but impossible for them to enter into substantive negotiations with Democrats. That has left the cap true to form. They seem to be intent on waiting until the absolute last minute to address all these issues that we've known about, said Maya McGuinness, president of the nonpartisan, nonprofit Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Basically tensions between key Senate Republicans and White House Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney have been on glaring display for months, and GOP lawmakers and aides partially blame that frayed relationship for the halting pace of talks. Mulvaney has been slow to come around to the need for a bipartisan budget deal that would raise domestic and military spending caps, even after McConnell met privately with Trump last month and got the president's blessing to proceed with such a deal, said a senior GOP Senate aide who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe private conversations. The problem with Mulvaney is sometimes he forgets he's a staffer now, so he's looking to execute on his own vision instead of the president's, and that slows down the process, the aide said. A Mulvaney spokesman did not respond to a request for comment on his relationship with Senate Republicans. But an administration, what those spending levels should be remains a point of contention between Senate Republicans and the administration, according to lawmakers and officials on both sides, and it's unclear when or how resolution will be reached. According to the administration also has pushed for raising the debt limit as soon as possible, while House Speaker Nancy Pelosi D. California has made clear that, "I think that's what we're trying to find out," said Senior John Thune SD. Senate Republicans and top aides have voiced frustrations with Mulvaney publicly and privately in recent weeks, with Shelby being particularly caustic in discussing Mulvaney's involvement in talks about a massive disaster aid bill that became law earlier this month after weeks of stalled negotiations. At one point Shelby also specifically requested Mulvaney's presence at his own meeting with Trump last month so that Mulvaney could hear Shelby describe the dire impacts if a budget deal is not reached. And after this week, the frustration with Mulvaney is bipartisan. At a news conference, the internal GOP disarray has provoked repeated criticisms from Democrats who blame Republicans for the failure of an attempt at high-level bipartisan talks last month, although Republicans say Democrats were to blame for refusing to budge on spending levels. "Let's hope the Republicans can get their act together," Senate Minority Leader Charles E. Schumer DNY said in a brief interview. The finger-pointing has transformed Congress' most basic mandate of funding the government into a high-stakes blame game with potentially devastating consequences. If new spending bill, at the same time, if a deal is not reached to lift automatic spending caps known as the sequester, the resulting automatic cuts would indiscriminately slash vital domestic programs and jeopardize military readiness, members of both parties warn. And the Treasury Department, if Congress does not act and Treasury runs out of money, which is forecast to happen sometime in late fall, Treasury would be unable to pay all of its bills on time, which could lead to a default on the government's obligations, a spike in interest rates, a surge in unemployment and a stock market crash. Fitch Ratings warn. Lawmakers and administration officials say they are aware of the urgency to act. But recent House Democrats have gone their own way on spending bills without Republican buy-in, putting a massive $983 billion appropriations package for the Health and Human Services Department, the Pentagon, and other agencies on the floor at spending levels Senate Republicans and the White House would never agree to. A bipartisan agreement, and it all comes against the backdrop of an intensely partisan debate over impeachment and a looming presidential campaign, which shall be called collateral issues that only compound the difficulty of reaching agreement. The result is a mess. This is one of the most basic requirements of governing, said Senior John Cornyn Art, Seung Min Kim at washpost.com.
Raindrop, drop top smoking, no cooking the hot pot. Fucking on your bitch, yeah, that. Looking up, open the park,